Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Amy Small-McKinney. And she's the author of the most recent chapbook, One Day I Am a Field. Before I introduce you to Amy, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Substack Poet newsletter if you aren't already. Just go to poet2poet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So today, again, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Amy Small-McKinney. Amy is the author of her third chapbook, One Day I'm a Field, which we'll be talking about today, which was written during the COVID pandemic and her husband's death. That was published by Glasslyre Press in 2022, just this year. For the 2020 virtual AWP, she co-moderated an interactive discussion, Writing Through Grief and Loss, the intersection of social and personal grief during COVID. Her second full-length book, Walking Toward Cranes, won the Kitara Book Prize in 2016. She's been published in numerous journals, for example, American Poetry Review, Cortland Review, and work is forthcoming in the Banyan Review. Most recently, she's proud to be a part of Aninga Press's forthcoming anthology dedicated to pregnancy, abortion, and choice. And her poems have been translated into Romanian and Korean. She lives in Philadelphia. So welcome, Amy. Nice to have you here.
Thank you so much, Radha, for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk about your beautiful new chapbook collection, One Day I Am a Field. And I thought we could start with a question I get from students quite a lot, which is, should I try to publish a chapbook or a full-length book? You've done both. And aside from the difference in length, I'm curious, how do you think about these two choices in publishing?
I'm thinking about when I was just starting out. And the idea at that time of putting together an entire book was kind of overwhelming for me, to be honest. And when I began to look, and I looked through my poems, I began to see surprising themes that I repeated over and over without even being conscious of it while I was writing. And I realized there was enough for a small book. And I discovered the chapbook. And I consider my first chapbook, I call it my calling card. I was so excited there was something that was out there in the world that belonged to me. And it also gave me the courage to then tackle a full-length book later. So I love chapbooks. I think they're brief but powerful. Small but powerful. And I would recommend beginning with them as I did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it's a little more doable for a poet who's starting out, or how do you think about?
Well, it's complicated. And to be honest, I don't think I felt I was a poet yet. I was still afraid to say I'm a poet. I still had very wobbly self-esteem. It seemed like a world I could never enter. Now, your students may be braver than I was. They may feel more confident than I was. But as I put my poems together, I saw I had about 24 to 30 that I felt really were strong. I had such confidence in that particular packet of poems that whatever my concerns were, whatever my fears, I believed in those poems. And so it was as if the chapbook called to me. Said, this is the first step. Before you get to the major leagues, this is it. Mm-hmm. That may not be true with every young poet, but this is how it felt for me.
Yeah. So a bit more approachable and sort of within the vision of who you felt you could be as a writer at that time.
And as I was moving towards beginning to realize I'm a poet. This is what I do. That was a process. And the chapbook was the first step.
Wonderful. So One Day I'm a Field, this is sort of a unique book, as all books are, but could you tell us a little bit about the process of developing the poems for this chapbook and where those poems started?
This book began like none other. It was COVID, and I was a caregiver for my ill husband who died. He had been in hospitals, he was in rehab. And the day that the rehab was ready to lock the doors to family, he wanted to come home and I agreed. And we understood what that might mean. But as a family with my daughter, we listened to him and made some choices. This book was not written, it was not a plan. There was nothing I expected from this. But I believe, and this is going to sound very corny, that in some way it saved my life. I was frenetic. I was feverish. I would leave his bed and run to my laptop, and I didn't even know what I was going to say. It sounds kind of like, oh, new age or something, but it's true. My fingers would hit the keyboard, and I did not know what was going to come out of that. I felt more like a vessel. And I did this through the whole process, thinking I had no goal, but I had to do this in part to survive and to put language to a grief that I could not put language to in any other way. After he died, sometime after, I looked at it and the poems surprised me. I was very grateful to them. I went, oh, okay, look at this. And I realized it was a chapbook. I also realized I did not want to write a full-length book. That where this book ended, it had to end. I was finished with this. I needed it to be out in the world. That doesn't mean I haven't written poems since. But for this particular chapbook, this what I called my grief book, this was it. And so I knew it was a chapbook. I knew I could not make it into a full length emotionally. But the poem said, this is it. And there was some kind of closure for me when it was sent out. So this process is clearly different from the usual for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, the difference in chapbook versus full length.
Yes.
In a moment, but first I just want to express my deep sympathy for your loss, and what a tremendous time to be going through something like that.
Yes. Thank you.
And thank goodness for poetry. I'm glad to hear it was a practice that helped.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So would you be so kind as to read us a poem from the book?
Thank you. I'd love to. Okay. I'm going to read During the Pandemic, You Are Dying at Home. Sparrows nibble at your blanket, dive in and out of the eaves of your mouth. Wings rimmed with tatting, tattooed beaks add color to an otherwise bland room. The hard-working birds will not speak to me yet. This is not the life I planned. Now the sky closes its doors and trees shrink into fetal positions. Your body shrinks. You forget where you are going. Your hospital bed tries to explain. You don't belong anymore. This is not the life we planned. We are breezeless, our window won't open. I wait with the sparrows for a sign to kiss your confused mouth goodbye. You say, I'm moving 3 across, 3 down. What if my pee is poison? Amy, get me my shoes.
This is beautiful.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit more about how the process was different for this book and for chapbooks in general versus the full-length collections that you've written. Yeah, just maybe walk us into your thinking around, when you say you knew this was just a chapbook, how does one know what they're working on?
What makes this question challenging for me is that I'm pretty controlling in life. I like to know where everything is, and I'm a planner. But poetry is a different world for me. In some way, I let it be in control. It's the one place I get to listen and just follow what's happening intuitively. Now, I have friends who are fabulous poets, but they plan and plan in their minds long before they write the poem, and they're marvelous poems. I don't know how to do that. It's so foreign to me, like a different language. So I think that's important to bear in mind when talking about all these processes. The second book I wrote, second full length, Walking Toward Cranes, I did write during and mostly after my breast cancer treatment. So clearly for me, my life is in the poems. But I don't ever want, I'm going off and I'll come back. I don't ever want content to manipulate the reader. I feel like this is not journaling. That may be where it begins. But the poems have to stand up, the craft, the music, the language. So yes, it comes from my life, like breast cancer. But then I expect, once I've let it all out, the internal editor kicks in, and I expect a lot of the poem. When I wrote Walking Toward Cranes, I was clearer that this was the subject. And I just kept writing it out until I knew it was going to be a book. But other than writing out the poems and knowing this was the theme, the subject, I didn't want to control it until I thought I had the poems. Once I had the poems, I began to see them as sectioned. I began to see them as the trajectory from treatment to some closure. One is never cured or closed. It cured, but some closure. And I just tackled it as a full-length book. I remember putting the poems across my floor, trying to see what was going on, where they might go in terms of their place in the book. I took a bunch out. And I should say, I revise even after I published. Mm-hmm. But I got to the point where I said, this book is strong enough for me to send it out. And I didn't have quite the same belief in it as I did my chapbook once I finished. But I felt this was solid. Did I go off, or does this answer your question?
This is a really, I love that you're sort of breaking it down by stages of the process.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. The poems had to be written before I realized that it was becoming a book. I didn't say, oh, I'm writing a book. But then I began to see, look at this. These are the themes. This is what they're doing. It's like I made my discoveries as the poems were emerging.
Mm-hmm.
So
it sounds like it's, it's not exactly a sort of how we would think about a logical process or a left-brained hyper-rational process, but nevertheless, there are these sort of distinct stages that you're describing that I think are really instructive for us to think about in terms of, having the work emerge from one's life, beginning to see some thematic possibilities.
Absolutely.
Perhaps not then saying, okay, I'm writing a book about this, but leaning into that thematic direction, that territory.
Trusting that these are making sense, even if you don't feel in control. Mm-hmm. And that's very important to me as a writer. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I did go to someone when I felt it was finished to look through the book with me and talk about how it might be sectioned, and someone who knew my voice, really knew my voice, and I trusted implicitly, a good friend. And that was helpful because then I needed someone outside of myself, a reader, to see it. And there were times I felt I couldn't see the trees for the forest. And it was very helpful when he did that. And that was later. That was when I already put it together. And it did change form several times till I was finished. By that time, the internal editor had kicked in, the rational person had kicked in, and the obsessive reviser had kicked in.
Well, would you like to read another poem? And maybe read it first, but I'm curious if after you read the poem, you might talk a little bit about where the poem started and how you revised it.
Oh gosh, okay, I think I picked an interesting one then to read. It's called Love/Furious. Not so cold that I want to stay indoors. Instead, that vacancy between fall and winter. The sidewalk here is crooked, broken, entire slices of cement missing. To walk, it is best to look down. I remember when I fell, my finger broken, my palm thickened with tangled branches that forced two fingers to bend as if looking away. Since he has died, I've awakened to a body broken, more damaged than I knew. The bones of my legs creak like floorboards. I can't find the body I knew before wipes, pills to save him, save him. I didn't hear my body ask me to look up, look at my mouth opposing itself, one side in a perpetual frown, the other still stupidly smiling. Why was the left side of my face shutting down, my eye closing, its lid covering half of the pupil? I did not see it. Or is this the divide between seasons, a caregiver's sleepwalk, the I am and I can't? I didn't hear my body ask me to look down, notice the purple bruise on my calf, notice the heavy wood bed frame I walked into. I must have been helping him tie his shoes or button his shirt or hanging on while he tried to stand. Or is this the divide? Loving furious, afraid furious. I wanted to pour myself into his spaces. I wanted to break from him like a rib. How many cells fit into love's nesting? Or is this a lie? or rather not the same truth for the woman, the I, now sitting by the file cabinet, sorting through history, deciding what to shred, what to save. She listens to voicemail. I listen to his voice over and over.
Lovely. There's a beautiful balance between, it's not exactly a story, but there are elements of story. And of course, the lyric, like you said, you're very lyrically oriented. And the
Yes.
balance between those is really wonderful in your work.
That was a little new for me because I haven't, I love much narrative poetry. It just hasn't been it's not how I've written. I've kind of been attracted to more hidden poets, like Jean Valentine was sort of a mother poet for me. Denise Levertov. So I tended towards that kind of poetry, a kind of hiddenness. So I startled myself when I realized I was a lot less hidden in this book, that I was telling some things, as they happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a question I get a lot from folks who are more lyrically oriented, and like you said, maybe a bit more drawn to the elliptical or mysterious type of poetic writing. They're asking, well, do I need to tell a story? This just came up in workshop the other day. Is this poem enough of a story? And I'm very adamant that absolutely not. You do not have to tell a story, but where those elements come together in a beautiful kind of balance, it just creates a lovely situation where I think a reader can kind of come into the territory of the book and feel that they're relating to the content.
Right. I think lyric poetry at its best invites in the reader, welcomes in the reader to add their own story. However, I really don't, lyric doesn't mean being, I'm having word finding here, just so abstract,
yeah,
that the reader can't come in. So sort of modern to it, that's not the word I'm looking for, but it has to be authentic. Mm-hmm. Even if the story isn't there, the emotions have to be there somehow, enough to let that reader in. So it's a fine balance between hiddenness and the concrete. Denise Levertov, I don't know how much she's read now, but she had written some poems called Daughter One, Daughter Two. I think it was Life in the Forest where they were published. And they're not easy to find anymore. They almost felt like she was practicing or experimenting. But I noticed she would take these leaps of imagination and lyrical leaps, and then she would always land not on the abstract, but on some very clear earthy objects. Mm. And I think that for me, when I was studying her, that was a lesson for me to try to move between the two. I don't care if I'm lyric or narrative. I care if the poem is working and somebody can enter it. Even if it is a little abstract, there has to be a door opened. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think about that in terms of the themes of your book, mm-hmm. With maybe grief being the obvious theme. Mm-hmm. So there's very large territory of grief that we all encounter at some point during our lives, but it can be very different for each individual. So the specificity of the feeling tones and like you said, the concrete details or the earthly details in the poems help us to enter that territory with you in the book?
You know, it felt very important to me. And once I was finished that whole sort of process of discovery, I realized that what I loved about the poem I just read was I had begun to talk about what it was like to be a caregiver. And I felt that I had permission to say this was really impossible, really very hard. And anyone who just, I was so sick of hearing, oh, you're so strong. Like, do not say that to me again. And when I've read this a few times, I've had people say to me, thank you. You're telling some truths about caregiving. It doesn't diminish the love you have, but it is awful. And yeah, for whatever that's worth, that meant a lot to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it speaks to the power that poetry books can have, I think, for folks. So it's a really wonderful situation when our work can function in that way. I mean, it's not all work does, but
no, it's really
it's a special thing.
It means a lot to me with this particular book. Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious to maybe change our conversation in a different direction slightly, maybe towards the more practical. How did you go about finding a publisher for this book and maybe for other books? What was your strategy? Did you submit to contests or open periods?
Well, I have a spreadsheet from about 2004, and I have lots of red. Red meant rejections. Blue was acceptance. And I spent, not for this book, but many years trying to get my books published. And do we have time for a little story?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
When I was studying with Jean Valentine, I didn't have an MFA then. I went when I was much older, but I would drive into New York City. And I'd shown Jean one of my first chapbook. And she had a good friend of hers, Kate Greenstreet, email me and say, Jean says, get your manuscript together and send it to Kevin Curry. And I said, what manuscript? I had some things together, but it wasn't a book yet. So this was crazy. I wasn't going to say no to Jean Valentine.
No.
Oh my God, thank you for believing in me. And I had a little one at home, and I said to my husband, for about 48 hours, don't talk to me. Tell her I'm writing a book. And I would hear her in the kitchen saying, we can't bother mommy. She's finishing her book. And I worked on this book, and I did send it to Kevin Curry. And as expected, it was rejected with a beautiful note. But what that did for me is it showed me something about putting together a book. And it wasn't the book I finally wrote, the first book, but it was pretty close. A whole lot of those poems went into my first book, Life is Perfect. And when I sent it out all over the place, and it was just rejected. Frankly, with the first book, a good friend of mine said she had just had a book published. She said, oh, I mentioned you're looking for a publisher, and my publisher would like to see it. I thought, thank you, poetry gods. And it was a local press, and they did an absolutely gorgeous job. They're defunct now, but I deeply appreciated them. One of the things I found was going somewhat locally or through friends was very helpful. Not that because someone's your friend, you're going to accept a book or poems. I've learned that. I love people who have to say no to me, editors, they're still friends. But I found that helped a lot. And where I am in Philadelphia, there's a vibrant poetry community. The second book, I sent out to about 5 places, but I heard from Glassliar first. and they told me I won an award. I remember crying, sobbing with joy that this had happened to me, because this is someone who did not know me, and they're out of Chicago. But between all of this, there were many, many years and many manuscripts that were rejected. And I'd say I went through contests, I went through open readings. My take-home lesson to my students has been the first few rejections are horrible, and then you can't take it personally. You don't know who's reading it. You don't know what they care about. Just keep going. And I was so persistent. I was impossible. And I think you need that to get published. Mm-hmm. I have another manuscript out now, a third that's been rejected. It was a finalist with Trio House, Barrow Street Press, and White Pine Press. But I've rewritten it with each finalist and each rejection, and now it's going out again. And so it takes a patience, and it takes a belief in oneself that isn't easy when you're younger and isn't easy when you're older. And when I say to friends, oh, I don't know if I can keep doing it, they understand. We could keep going, sister poet, keep going. And it's part of the process to feel sometimes disheartened. Mm-hmm. But if you can afford contests, I've done that. I sometimes become like, I cannot afford $1 more, even though I know it's for these wonderful presses, and I'm glad to be able to contribute to these presses. Certainly when I was younger, it was difficult. I'd go on by Poets and Writers, go on New Pages, wherever you can learn about contests, and then look at those particular presses and see, does this feel like a fit? Will they even be interested in what I have to say? So yeah, this is not ended for me. I'm still in there with your students.
Well, it's interesting. I had a conversation with Sean Singer, the poet Sean Singer, who
has,
yeah. He said, and he won the Yale Younger Poets Series award sometime back, and I thought he said it really well. He said, well, the award you get, or the result that you get in poetry when you reach a milestone it's another mountain to climb. There's always another mountain to climb, and so it really is sort of a never-ending challenge around this part where we're getting stuff out into the world. But I love what you're saying about really being persistent, really developing a sense of yourself as an artist, as somebody worthy of having a public audience. Right?
That's a process, a parallel process with the writing, feeling worthy. Yeah,
and the community really can provide some of that.
Yes,
that nurturance that we need to persevere and to develop.
We're hungry. We're a hungry bunch emotionally, and it's interesting, Sean. I sent this manuscript that hasn't been taken yet, that's a finalist, to Sean, and asked him to help me with some editing, because I just love his work so much and how he approaches poetry. So he's helped me with this last version of the book I'm sending out. Just so that's funny that you mentioned to him. Yeah, it's finding community is essential for one's mental health, I think, while you're doing this. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, would you like to read one more poem before we close out?
Oh, I love to. And I just want to say, I was a little nervous about this, but you have made this it's like I'm talking to a good friend. So thank you, Radha.
Oh, you're welcome.
This is Before the World Ends, and it was after a canoe model, 1851 British Museum. Before the world ends. I will put on shoes with cork soles, Carry him along our tree-lined streets. He'll be heavy. We will make it to the river, float in water, not earth, not trench and stone. I want sun in our mouths as calm as seed cakes. Him to drift beside me into the night, even when even the gate has shut behind us. Time enough to become two slight boats built from paper bark, moored together in parting.
It's just beautiful.
Thank you so much.
So in closing, what so people can go buy the book at any bookstore? How can they get the book?
I would recommend highly, because I love them and should tell you that Glass Layer Press is an amazingly supportive, nurturing, gorgeous group of people. And I would go through their press, Glass Layer Press.
Okay.
They have a big bookstore, and it does take some scrolling down to find it, but it's under Chapbooks. Oh, I also have a website, and it talks about how to order the book as well. And that's very simple. It's amysmall-mckinney.com, no hyphen. And yes, you can do Amazon and Barnes and Noble. I'm trying to support my press, but I appreciate if you buy it. I appreciate that from wherever.
So we can visit Glasslyre, and I'll put these links in the text.
Mm-hmm.
So Glasslyre Press and Amy's website to learn more about how to order and learn more about you and your work.
I can always send a signed copy. We could work that out too. Yeah.
That'd be wonderful. How about social media? Any presence there that you want to mention?
Yes. This is so funny. I started on Facebook many years ago because my daughter was on it. Now, of course, she's 31. She's long gone from Facebook. But what I discovered there, especially during COVID, is an amazing poetry community. And I thought, what a gift that came out of COVID. I mean, social, not too many gifts, but this was a gift. I'm on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter, though that remains to be seen. And I'm on Instagram. Okay. And so I am, the only one I'm not on is, what is it, TikTok or something? Yeah. And I don't know. I haven't gotten there yet, but this is fine for me. So yes, you can find me there. I'd be happy to meet any of you, any of your listeners.
Great, wonderful. Well, Amy, thank you so much. It's been such a treat to hear your work read aloud and to have some insight into your process. So thank you so much for this interview.